Now, this audience, I think, is very familiar with the Janus case. It was sort of the Friedrich case part 2, but Scalia had passed away and had saved public sector unions. And we now live in essentially, in terms of public sector unions, a so-called right-to-work country, which means that, of course, you always had the right to work. I mean, to the extent that the employers will hire you, subject to the employers. But now, agency fees, the payments for the negotiations, and I think probably even more expensively, the issues that come up under the contract, whether it's...
So this is the difference. First off, I think the word right to work is the biggest misnomer I've seen.
Of course, right.
But what has happened is that a lot of these right-wing groups that, frankly, first, who didn't want integration in schools, didn't want integration in the workplaces, they started doing things that would separate people from each other. And they used the pretext of choice, but you saw it after Brown versus Board of Education. You saw it in what happened in Virginia afterwards, where all of a sudden school districts closed because they said, well, we want to give people the choice of, going to this elementary school, also known as we do not want to integrate this elementary school.
Right.
And we saw that in labor as well around the same time. Right to work was about not allowing an integrated workforce and starting to pit people against one another. Having said that, what has happened in the Janus case was that it overruled basically 45 years of precedent where about 23 states, under the 10th Amendment of the Constitution, had made a decision that it was in the interest of labor peace and efficiency of services. If workers wanted to, they could create unions, and that the public employer would bargain with the unions just like GM bargains with UAW.
Right.
And then
I have 10,000 employees.
Right.
I don't want to negotiate with each one
exactly.
of them. I want to have... Right.
But the obligation of the union, which gets lost in a lot of this, was that if they had the solemn responsibility to bargain the contract, then they bargained for everybody.
Right.
And the obligation of people was not to join the union. People didn't have to join, but they had to pay a fair share for the work that the union did in representing them in contract negotiations for health benefits, for pensions, for salaries. That's, frankly, what just got busted up.
Right. That was the ruling from the Abood,
right.
Detroit versus Abood.
And what happened, and the last thing I'll say is what happened was what Abood said 45 years ago said that Abood took the First Amendment issues, the free expression issues off the table, because Abood said, you, union, if somebody doesn't want to be involved politically, they don't have to be involved politically. What you have the responsibility for doing is the terms and conditions of employment. So the issue of political expression hasn't been an issue for 45 years.
Right. And this is, and we should just say...
That's why this case is so ideological, and why Justice Kagan said it was weaponizing the First Amendment.
Exactly. And we should say, and I want to get more to, how you're responding in this particular environment that we're in and those things, but we should say that this is just one element of the weaponizing of the First Amendment. We just saw it in a case about fake abortion clinics in California. The First Amendment is being used, literally wielded in every direction. That just depending on what the preferred outcome is.
It's being used as a sword,
exactly,
as opposed to what the original intention was of the framers and the founders, as a shield so that people could engage in political speech and not be discriminated against by the government when they engaged in that political speech.
Right. There's this whole theory that is being developed of forced speech, and the implication is that by paying for services that are required by your employer, right, it's really basically... and they're going to do this when it comes to washing your hands in the if you're an employee, washing your hands. It's some type of forced expression.
Look, they may bring a case. I mean, this all started, frankly, if you think about it, Citizens United, Justice Kennedy, basically equated unlimited corporate donations as political speech.
Right.
So that was the first time all of a sudden money became speech.
And so there's a whole
I
a body of
digress,
work on
sorry.
this. Yes, no, and again, I point people back to this. I think it was Haley Sweeten Edwards had written about this a couple of years ago about the weaponizing of the First Amendment. But all right, but more to the point in terms of what you're doing here. Give me the reaction. Like what? Obviously, you saw Janus coming, at least since the 2016 election on November 9th. I would imagine that was one of the first things you started to think about.
You mean that elections have consequences?
That elections have consequences, but that Janus, you saw this coming down the pike. People knew there was another one in the pipeline as soon as it got picked up by the Supreme Court.
Well, let me just be clear as a legal matter, because the right wing is now actually using that argument to try to see if they can get retroactive application of Janus. So I want to be, meaning there's now 17 cases that the right wing has brought after Janus, some of which trying to say, oh no, because Justice Alito has been talking about this for the last 5 years, you saw it coming, therefore you should have 5 years ago.
So you're saying clawback?
Yeah.
Agent? Oh my.
I'm like, so I want to be, so I'm not,
Wow.
I'm not being funny about this. I want to be. So,
That's insane.
So it's insane. But but when you have a Supreme Court that no longer is doctrinal, but is just ideological.
Right.
You have
Everything's on the table.
Everything's on the table.
Okay.
And so, but let me. So what we saw is that I actually sat through the Friedrich's oral argument, and I sat through the Janus oral argument. I pretend that I still practice law every now and then.
And there's big stakes.
And I wanted to hear it. And so in February 2015, Lee Saunders, the head of ASME, came to our executive council, and we had talked about this beforehand. And from that day forward, we started planning a very different strategy about member engagement. We've always wanted members to be engaged in the union, and frankly, when they are, the union is much stronger. But the shift was that this was now an imperative. It wasn't precatory, it was mandatory now. And we had to think through how we shifted culture from a culture of members feeling like, okay, they elected their local leader, they elected their state or national leader, and then the leaders did the things. Right. And we had to figure out a way that the members not only felt that power, but were engaged and connected and saw themselves and saw the stakes saw themselves in the union and saw the stakes very clearly.
I mean, this is broadly a problem that we have with our citizenship in this
right,
country.
Exactly right.
It changed
because voice. Exactly right. Because voice became, well, it's it's somebody else. I did my job. I elected somebody. And then people stopped voting, and on and on. So we had to really change culture to a culture of reimagining engagement and reimagining recommitment. And so that started for us in February 2015. And it started by one-to-one conversations. And so if you look at our resolutions dating back to April, May of 2015, we put ourselves on a course of how we're going to have, and we were going to have, one-to-one conversations with all our members that started as simply as, how are you? What's going on? Knocking on people's doors, having these meetings in school meetings or site meetings, showing up. And you see from the themes of our convention, caring, fighting, showing up. And so the run-up to Janus was much more about what we were going to do to re-engage our members in the union as not transactional, but a part of their lives.
I noticed in your speech. In fact, I wrote this down. It's obviously the theme, but you said there, you had at one point a bit of an epiphany that member engagement and community involvement around issues that matter is the pathway for
Right.
a better life, but also I imagine the success of unions. So I mean, and then I think
Yeah, I often say community is the new density.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because I know that we touched on this, and I think the last time we spoke was a couple of years ago, but on this burgeoning, and maybe it's not that burgeoning, but social justice unionism.
Right.
And in some respects, I mean, is that what, are you saying something similar there?
Yes.
Okay.
But what the difference between what I did today versus the conversations you and I have had beforehand, and even any speeches that I've given at the AFT, is that the formula, spelling it out, it's not rhetorical anymore. I used examples that people in that audience saw because they have been doing it. And so this was really a reflection, a mirroring back to people of what they've been doing. And frankly, I believe it is the path forward for us, because you have right now, and Hillary Clinton actually said this by using Dickens' words, you have a juxtapositioning in this country between basically oligarchic, authoritarian, cronyistic, kleptocratic takeover of most of the organs of national power versus tremendous activism on the ground of people wanting a better life. And it is that kind of David versus Goliath battle where people seem to get it, and it feels like, will the will of the people prevail, or will the oligarchy prevail?
Do you think?
It is social justice and economic justice. It is in some ways what King said in the "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963. As
part of that is engaging in the community, because I want to talk about, like, what does that mean, A, and B, do you think teachers are uniquely situated to do that, or do you think that maybe there's certain advantages that teachers and frankly nurses on some level as well? I mean, they have a similar dynamic in terms of there's a set group of people who there's not as much like a pull. There's a pull coming from the community as opposed to a push that would have to go for the teachers. I mean, being a parent of two kids and
let me just
the son of frankly older parents. I mean,
right. Let me just say this. I think it's more, I look at things these days through a lens of values and responsibility. And I think because teachers and nurses are really the caring professions, that we are skilled to care and to help nurture, nurses, the body, teachers, the brain. And so we are in a position of great responsibility and can, as a result, if people are willing to do it, help move cruelty to decency. And that's what I think you see. I mean, teachers shouldn't have to do this job. Just like teachers shouldn't have to take money out of their pockets to buy supplies. But it takes a really special person to want to be a teacher or a nurse. Frankly, I would argue who wants to be a probation officer, who wants to actually be a civil service who's making sure the water is clean in Montana. So we, in some ways, I'm one of the luckiest people on earth because I get to represent the people who really care about other people.
Right. I guess what I'm asking is,
So I think the answer to your question is yes, but it's not opportunistic. That's why I'm answering this
Okay.
way. It is because of who we are as people. And the dilemma is because our governance structure right now, because in some ways it's been hijacked. I think the Republican Party has been hijacked too. If you look at Steve Schmidt and what he talks about, or even Joe Scarborough, and frankly, I
got to tell you.
I have sparred with them a lot, but on the issue of democracy, if you hear them, I mean, not on the issue of economics, but on the issue of democracy, they're
Steve
pretty
Schmidt, the guy,
upset.
the guy who gave us.
Yep. You don't even have to finish answering.
I'm just saying, like, Sarah Palin didn't come out of nowhere,
Right.
And
But,
Joe Scarborough, who also I would say, I mean,
Listen,
I
I'm
say
married
this-
to a rabbi.
I
I
say
believe
this-
in redemption.
That's all well and good. That's all well and good.
No, I get your
I'm
point, and you're
perfectly
right.
willing to allow your husband to go
Wife.
and provide or your wife to go and provide the redemption. That's fine. So all right,
Anyway, seriously, I'm sorry.
Well, no, but I want to ask you because, all right, aside from it not being opportunistic,
Yeah, so I
mean that's fine.
I agree
mean,
with you.
But I am looking at it from a pure strategy and power. I want to just look at this from a purely a power perspective.
Right.
Okay. So, and I think there is a natural tendency for teachers, obviously, and nurses. Their jobs are to care about people, and so they're going to develop these relationships.
Correct.
But there's also a strategy to this, and there's also going further than just the parents too, right? I mean,
Correct.
there's also
And in
you
fact-
have questions as to where else are we going to exercise this power that we have, and to leverage these relationships that we already have with the community.
Correct. And in fact, if you remember, and frankly, there were corporate Democrats who were as guilty as this as Republicans like Betsy DeVos. Joel Klein was one of them. Michelle
Sure.
Rhee was one of them. That they actually tried to strip teachers of that dignity and those relationships and that strength during the last recession, basically trying to say over and over again that the biggest issue in teaching was tenure, as opposed to the biggest issue in teaching is how do we recruit and retain great teachers for all our kids? How do we pay them sufficiently enough so that they're not doing 3 or 4 or 5 jobs? How do we have the tools and conditions so we meet kids where they are and help nurture them? And if somebody is not doing their job, due process should not be interpreted
Right.
as a job for life. There should be real evaluation systems. But we had to actually fight through that garbage that was thrown at us in state after state after state as a pretext for austerity and for laying teachers off. And what's happened now, in 25 states still spend less money on education. And what you saw in West Virginia, Oklahoma, Kentucky, Colorado, Arizona, was teachers basically saying, look, I love doing this job, but I can't keep on working 2 and 3 and 4 jobs.
Right.
And I gotta actually feed my own family. And this is what was so amazing. And when you try to pit me against my students, I'm not taking the raise and you taking that out of my students' hide. We need to actually have enough money for both, for the kind of conditions for kids. And I think what shocked the country was how much public support teachers in these red states got for what they were doing.
I spoke today to one of the Oklahoma City president at the AFT. And he, I think, said that even they were surprised that nothing after a couple of weeks, there was not the sort of fall off that he had anticipated.
Right.
People were still bringing, and so I guess.
But that activism that we saw in those red states, that's also what you're seeing. Well, it is and it isn't. And the reason I say it is in terms of activism. The reason I say it is and it isn't, because there are the issue about collective bargaining is absolutely an essential pathway for working people to have a better life. So what I think you're also seeing in those states that were the blue states that just lost agency fees as a result of Janus, you see also an incredible model of re-engagement and of actually doing more political work in those states. So the irony in both the states that had collective bargaining and the states that didn't have collective bargaining is that you're going to see more political action. That what Alito and Kennedy tried to snuff out actually is going to backfire hugely because people will be more politically engaged. And that is the model. Now, would it be better if a lot of problems actually got solved? There's numerous problems in education or in nursing. At a bargaining table where people could talk them through, yeah, of course. But what you're seeing now is that they're not going to be talked through, and the employer or the state is not going to respect people. It's not going to be the Koch brothers that employer is going to have to reckon with. It's going to be teachers and parents that are saying, you need to solve these problems because public education is a public good for our kids.
If I was asked you to take a bet, is there going to be more, put aside what just happened, I mean, obviously this will implicate your answer maybe, but is there going to be more withholding of labor in the next 5 years than there was in the last 5?
Yes, and Alito will end up, look, Alito's dismissiveness and derisiveness of the issue of labor peace is what elitists do. Because they live in their little white towers where they don't actually engage with the people. And what has happened is that when you had collective bargaining, both in the private sector and the public sector, you saw less strikes. You saw less stoppages of work. When you had it in the public sector, what you saw is people ended up solving problems at a bargaining table. And if you don't have that ability to do that anymore, or you have less of that ability to do that, you're going to take it on the streets because these problems have to get solved. The issue about having enough wages to live in a democracy for yourself and your family, the issue of making sure that you're not one illness away from bankruptcy, the issue of making sure that there's public education for special needs kids, making sure you don't have class sizes of 60 or 70 so you can't teach kids. These are legitimate issues. Right. And if we can't solve them at a bargaining table, we're going to try to solve them because this is what people need.
Do you anticipate having more conversations with unions outside? I mean, obviously, you guys are affiliated with the AFL-CIO. I mean, but do you anticipate sitting down and looking across industries that you may not have ever sort of contemplated in the past and saying, you know, we need to have some solidarity that transcends union affiliation, industry affiliation, even genre, right? Like,
yes.
I mean, is that?
And it's
are we going to see more of that?
Look, first off, Lee Saunders and I both went and spoke at the NEA convention. Mary Kay Henry, Lee, Lily are all coming here. We did a video together. Those are the 4 largest public sector unions. Larry Cohn and I have talked about how to have some conferences on sectoral bargaining. Now, Larry is no longer the head of the CWA, but we are really thinking through different kinds of ideas. The Democrats in the Senate and in the House of Representatives have 2 or 3 really good, intriguing bills that, if they were in the majority, would pass on how you empower labor. Some ways of growing traditional bargaining paradigms, some new ways. But I do think that this does call for re-envisioning a new way of workers working together, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, because collective bargaining is a really important way that you create a better pathway for people. It is the route. That and the ballot box are the route to the middle class. But think about, and I mentioned this in my speech, the teachers worked with the steelworkers in Messina, New York, to put pressure on Governor Cuomo, Senator Schumer, the company itself, to keep the Alcoa plant up in the North Country. That was working together in a way that nobody expected. But we understood that if we don't have that industry in the town, how are people going to be employed? We're doing that with our pension systems, where our pension systems are arrayed together to try to build infrastructure and create jobs. We also are using pensions or talking to trustees about these hedge funds who try to eat up companies, take them over, and then throw the and then close the plants.
Right.
So there's lots of different ways that we're talking together, some of which is done under the auspices of the AFL-CIO, which has a futures process going on, but some of it is being done bilaterally between and amongst unions.
When you look back over the past, the past 10 years, but you've obviously been a union member for years before that, are there moments where you look back and you say, you know what, maybe we should have at that time? Like, you look at different junctures.
Yes,
maybe
there's a lot of would have, could have, should have.
What's one of the big ones?
Well, let's look at Wisconsin, and the I would actually say 2008 to 2010. And, I've had some of these conversations with President Obama when in the tail end of his presidency, like on the issues of education. But I would have pushed that administration much, much harder. For me, it would have been a litmus test that if Joe Biden and President Obama said that they were going to walk those picket lines, they needed to be out there when Scott Walker basically stripped people of rights, because no one was prepared for what happened in 2010. There was we had a terrible recession. The president, the vice president, others, they helped with the stimulus they did get us out of that recession. But the right wing was ready to bear, or was ready for bear. And the moment the 10 election happened, what did they do? They went after labor.
Sure.
They went after public education. They went after voting. We all know
within months. It was 4 months after the 2010 election.
They did it quickly because they knew if it took them a long time, then we would have won those fights, not lost those fights. And you saw immediately the collapse of the labor movement in Wisconsin. And that was a woulda, coulda, shoulda. And today we had, frankly, several members from Wisconsin, from Milwaukee, and we took a picture and we looked at each other and I said, we have learned the lessons of what happened in Wisconsin. You are not seeing post-Janus that result. What you're seeing instead is members understanding that's the right wing that's trying to take their rights away. They are really pissed and they're sticking with the union.
What was the lesson, though, specifically in that context? Yes, Obama had said, "I'll put on my soft walking shoes."
The lesson was we weren't prepared. The lesson was that it's the culture change that I just talked about.
I see.
It's the sense of, and I say this often.
You have to be in a constant state of preparing and building power.
Exactly.
Even before you need to use it.
And it's not building power of the leader, building power by her or himself or with a group of a few people. It is, how do you create a shared sense of ownership in a real way over a shared sense of values so that people own it? People see it. People don't want to lose it. It's like the story I told about my cousin, about her local leader showing their contract versus the piece of paper in Texas. And that is one piece of the story. But to me, the more important piece of that story for me was to hear her then proudly talk about her involvement in the union,
Right.
and that she was now taking ownership, that it was her power, and it was not, what is the union going to do for you? It's, wait a second, we could lose this if we're not engaged. That's the transformation, and frankly, we did that in the Capitol in Wisconsin. I was in the Capitol. I was in Madison. It was amazing. It was amazing to see the farmers supporting us, but we did that with activists. Now what's happened is that we have engaged the vast majority of our members who see, whether they're going to be active or not, that the union is important to them. That's the difference, and that's what's happened in the aftermath of Janus. That's why when we heard people today, the recommitments that, because in January of this year, so we started down this path of one-to-one conversations and engagement, but in January of this year, we talked to lots of different folks, and we started on the path of recommitments, recarding. And that's, we already have 530,000 people of the 800,000 people
That's
affected by Janus who have recarded. And that's why now the Freedom Foundation has said in Washington State, oh, no. None of the cards that were done before June 27th are legal. Now, that's bullshit. It's a frivolous lawsuit. With a judge who understands the Constitution and wants to apply it, you would get attorney's fees for that kind of frivolity. But that's what I mean by the 17 cases against us.
All right, and let me just ask you. I mean, so we have a vision of what unionism is going to look like. The irony is too is that I know that if we had this conversation a couple of years ago, we would have been talking about the so-called education reform movement, and you mentioned there were Democrats, and Arnie Duncan. I don't know what your perspective is.
I found it pretty funny that he was starting to call for for student walkouts because of gun issues.
Right.
I mean, look, I understand the frustration, and I think it's right. We have to do something in the aftermath of Parkland.
Right.
But I found it a little ironic.
Yes. Arnie Duncan was not exactly a bottom-up type of
Right.
But
I supported it, but I found it ironic.
Bill Gates Foundation, just very quietly the other day, the Rand Corporation came out with a report. They got virtually no news. Basically said, like, that's $700 million. Whoops. The whole teacher evaluation thing, we got that wrong. It basically said it's about inputs. If you want to help education, it's about inputs. Kids can't show up to school with a vocabulary deficit. They can't show up with a nutrition deficit. You got to deal with healthcare. You got to deal with the community. And that $700 million, of course, was also exponentially, a lot of people spent money in that direction because that's where a bulk of the money went. And so there was this whole movement. That seems to have sort of like completely fallen apart. There's a new battle here, but do you feel like things on at least a philosophical perspective on education have actually improved?
Yes.
While the material...
So frankly, and I know a lot of people don't give her enough credit for this, Hillary Clinton, in running in 2016, helped hugely to put these battles to bed, as did Barack Obama in the willingness to negotiate and agree to the new ed reform law, ESSA, because a lot of the overreach of No Child Left Behind and of Race to the Top got muted in the new law through the prohibitions on the secretary. And so you had Democrats like myself who said, oh, no. We need to prohibit the secretary from mandating testing as part of teacher evaluation, because that was part and parcel of what created the testing fixation.
Right.
We have to mandate that the Secretary of Education can no longer demand that schools be closed. We have to mandate that the Secretary of Education can no longer require a set of standards or curriculum. And if you had asked me 10 years ago as a Democrat, 20 years ago as a Democrat, would I ever have been fighting for that? I'd be looking at you like, wait a second. I thought, war on poverty, Secretary of Education, it's about expanding equity. But because of their overreach, including Democratic overreach, because Democrats, that's why I did this in the speech today as well, Democrats as well as Republicans, corporate Democrats as well as Republicans, thought they could reduce students to test scores and teachers to algorithms.
Right.
And we fought that back. And if you looked at the Democratic platform, that the Bernie folk and the Hillary folk all negotiated together when it came to education. It wasn't perfect, but it actually was a template for how to resolve these issues. And then on top of that, you had a Betsy DeVos who basically gave up the pretense that charters or vouchers was about equity. It was really just about privatizing a school system and
Right.
having people fend for themselves.
Right. When she talks about public education, she's talking about a pool of money that she can channel to
Correct,
to
exactly.
private schools.
So then what you have is these corporate Democrats who say, well, am I with public education or am I with her?
Right.
And so she has in some ways forced their hand. And so, there are still charter folks like, look, the LA School Board, and the fact that Ref Rodriguez is still on that school board is terrible. But there are still battles like that. But when you have the NAACP saying, look, we want a moratorium on charters until the equity issues start working for all the students, and then you have what you just have seen throughout the country, which is people believe in public education, they think teachers need to be more respected and have the latitude to do their job, have to be paid more, so we actually get teachers who are not just basically living paycheck by paycheck and being crushed by their student debt. So
All right. Lastly,
Anyway.
let me ask you this, because you raised the 2016 election. There was some controversy about the timing of
Yes.
the endorsement. If you had to do that over again, would you do the process different? Would you, with the timing, with the process, are there any reforms relative to that, or what?
Well, I mean, the answer is, of course, yes and no. I thought I would actually push very hard for the 16 election to have done what we did in terms of moving early. Because you either, in the 16 election, you either chase the race or you frame the race. And on the issue of public education, we needed to make it quite clear that the issues that we were pushing for needed to be forefront, not the corporate folk like the Michelle Rees and the Joel Kleins, who had basically tried to hijack the Democratic Party away from teachers, parents, and those who actually believed in music and art in schools rather than testing. What I would have done differently, and what I didn't actually understand at that time, was how the climate and the distrust and the frustration had so poisoned every institution. And Tim Schneider has said this a lot in his book, 20 Steps for Tyranny. But at the end of the day, the moment somebody says everything is rigged, it doesn't, because we had more interaction, more engagement before that endorsement in the primaries than we'd ever had before. Not just polling, not just town halls, not just talking to people, but people who disagreed with the decision didn't believe that any of that had happened. So that the issue, in retrospect, was how do you create trust in a situation where people don't trust? And that's what the issue was. In terms of going forward, I think you have to wait and see. There's a lot of people that are coming out. You got to see what's going on. But frankly, more importantly than anything else, I'm fixated on the 2018 election. Right. Because we have to win enough in 2018 to move cruelty to decency and to defend our democracy.
Randi Weingarten, president of the American Federation of Teachers, thank you so much
Thank you.
for your time today. I
Thank
really
you.
appreciate it.